Hello everybody, this is Peter, and I am going to heroically try to cover the history of health policy in about 10 minutes. We have to start somewhere, so it might as well be at the beginning. As humans moved from Africa up through Europe and Asia and then into the Americas, humans tended to live in small groups of hunters and gatherers. Hunters and gatherers primarily had to deal with gathering stuff up, like berries, hunting animals, and mating. Nothing else. Life was pretty easy, and this took about 20 hours a week. But there were huge downsides to this way of living as well. Humans had to confront predators, and there were times of starvation and scarcity. Once Homo sapiens figured out that you could take seeds, put them in the ground, and grow things, and that you could capture animals instead of killing them and put them in a pen, then it became possible to solve these problems. By living collectively together, humans were able to defend themselves against predators, hunger, and also to provide other benefits such as collective living. Of course, this also had downsides. One downside was that you created a hierarchical society. Somebody had to do the accounting. How much are we harvesting? Where are the animals? Where are they all going? Somebody had to lead the humans. And so, of course, this led to hierarchies. There were other problems that this also created. With every new solution comes a new set of problems. Perhaps the biggest problem was that collective living meant that humans were in contact with domesticated animals and in contact with their own feces. Their own feces contaminated the water supply. So parasites, bacteria, and viruses learned to evolve right alongside this new way of human collective living. As society started to grow bigger, this problem became bigger. And so, by the 1800s, when people were living in cities, life expectancy dropped all the way down to 30 years in most Western cities, Scandinavia being the exception because, of course, they figured out how to solve this problem before anybody else. This problem had a very simple solution, and sanitation was able to bring life expectancy up dramatically. But these kinds of solutions also created novel kinds of even more serious problems. For example, now that we're living in nation states, we have to contend with war, with people now having clearly conquered animals. Then the population density of humans increase, so then we have to confront pandemics. So there are all sorts of new problems that arise as we solve the old ones. Another third problem is that we were able to create global financial systems. So we invented money as a way of bartering a long time ago, but then these forms of bartering became global, and that led to the possibility of massive economic crises, as we saw it with the stock market crash in 1929, followed by World War I, which was called the War to End All Wars. With this massive death and destruction, we came up with a whole new way of dealing with war. That was called the League of Justice. League of Justice was, this might not be right. The League of Nations. So the League of Nations was a global governing body that was set up to solve the problems of war and to provide a mechanism for nations to communicate with one another so that we could have global exchange of commerce without conflict. Unfortunately, the winners dominated the League of Nations, leaving nations like Germany in a terrible position of disadvantage. We all know how that turned out. Germany put all the resources into developing a massive war machine that led to the United States and Russia putting their resources into developing a national war machine, and it didn't turn out well. Following World War II, we really figured out, well, we've created this series of public health crises: war, pandemics, economic instability, and we need a way to sort of manage all this that is more equitable and just. So we scrapped the League of Nations and formed the United Nations. Oddly, we still gave veto power to the big national victors. To deal with global pandemics that led up to World War I, we developed the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization was going to deal with things like poor sewage and sanitation in low-income settings and pandemics in global settings. But of course, we have the problem of the nuclear bombs still. With the Russians having nukes and America having nukes, the Cold War started. At this point, nations were pitted against nations, not on the basis of regular alliances, but on the basis of economic ideology. This Northern Vietnamese propaganda poster basically sums it all up. The United States strategy was, hey, eat democracy. The Soviet strategy was, eat communism. But that's not exactly how it turned out. Take Guatemala, for example. This was one of 193 military interventions the United States was involved in. In Guatemala, they had elected a president democratically using a Jeffersonian system in which there was a House of Representatives, Congress, and a judicial branch, and an executive branch. Sound familiar? The United States didn't like it. Why? Because as a very poor nation, socialists and communists tended to win positions in the government. So we overthrew it. Being a very poor country, it only took us a day to do so. Of course, our official position was Camelot. We're going to have this peaceful global society in which the rule of law and democracy flourish under the great example of the United States. That didn't stop us from supporting Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, who killed anybody who couldn't pronounce perejil. He did this because Haitians had a disadvantage in the Spanish language, and they said perejil differently from Dominicans. We also supported this dude, another genocidal maniac who killed 1 in 8 people in his nation, Pol Pot. This didn't end too well either. On September 11th, 1973, we put this nice-looking guy into office in Chile, overthrowing a robust socialist democracy there. On September 11th, 2001, it could well have been the Chileans striking the World Trade Center. We have almost every day of the year covered. Fidel Castro in Cuba had kind of a cool idea for the United States global hegemony. That was to sort of create a union amongst low-income countries so that they would have collective bargaining power over high-income countries. Most countries didn't take up the idea. The United States had too much leverage and control. But some nations thought, this is a really good idea. Those happen to be the oil-producing nations of the world, mostly centered in the Middle East, and mostly with very weak institutions. So not much by way of schools, not much by way of infrastructure, and certainly not much by way of banking or financial infrastructure. These countries unionized and hiked up the price of oil, putting a huge dent in the notion of global capitalism as inflation increased. Lower income countries now had to take out loans to pay for basic needs such as heating and cooking and driving from point A to point B. So these nations became very poor. Wealthy nations had the banks and infrastructure. So the money just basically poured from low-income countries straight through the Middle East and into high-income banks. with the money going into Switzerland and the United States primarily, these banks decided, well, hey, that's a great idea. We have all this money and there's all these countries that need to borrow. So let's just hike up interest rates and lend it right back to them. With US banks and international lending organizations now holding huge leverage over the rest of the world, we could basically hold the rest of the world hostage. Throughout the 1970s, inflation skyrocketed and interest rates skyrocketed, and banks just lent continuously out to low-income countries, which could no longer pay their bills. Enter the 1980s. These institutions that we created post-war, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, that were supposed to deal with economic crises like the stock market crash of 1929, were instead the arbitrators of how low-income and middle-income countries were supposed to spend their money. They decided, hey, if you want to make yourselves debt-free, you better divest. You better stop investing in schools, stop investing in roads, stop trying to develop yourself, and just focus on paying back these loans, because without paying back the loans, you're never going to be able to get anywhere. So this is going to be a hard period. This is called structural adjustment. It often involved devaluing currency, making it easier to export, but making inflation higher for the people within the country and life harder for people within the country. This was an extremely hard period for low-income countries. There was starvation, there were riots, and this was basically all caused by these institutions that were supposed to be making life better for people on Earth and not worse. By the late 1980s, it was pretty clear that the Soviet Union was on the brink of economic collapse. So they approached the United States and Europe and basically said, let's make a deal. Let's get rid of NATO on the Western side, and we will completely give up our communist system, and we'll give up a lot of our nuclear weapons. We'll sort of revert to a idealist global vision in which everybody can have free exchange of commerce. You make a small concession, we'll make some big concessions, and the world will be a much better place. Part of the deal was the United States would give up NATO, Europe would give up NATO. Another part of the deal is that we would enter into sort of a Swedish-style socialist democracy. Of course, none of that happened. These two guys were elected, and the idea here was the United States would enter into a different kind of economic arrangement. This would be an arrangement in which there would be globalization of supply chains, such that low-income nations could produce things and become wealthy in doing so. And they would also become interdependent on one another. And the idea there was, okay, well, imagine a world in which we're all just one giant factory. You can't really have war under those circumstances, because if one country goes to war with another, then the supply chains are disrupted, and it's terrible, for everybody's economy. So that will put a brake on conflict. The American left wasn't too happy about this idea. There were protests. I was involved in these protests too when I was very, very young. And the protests were all about this notion that the United States was effectively exploiting people in low-income countries where there was less environmental protection, less worker safety protection, and goods were being produced at a lower cost, but at great cost to American workers who were under protections. So it wasn't seen as a great trade-off at the time by the left. In the center, there was consensus that this was actually a good deal. Like the cost of a television would be super, super cheap. And so that would offset, the fact that some factory workers were losing their union jobs. During this time, we sort of forgot about the Soviet Union. It was a nation with nuclear weapons, but they couldn't even beat the Chechens within their own borders, who were sort of a ragtag army. Their own army was exposed as a paper tiger, with their soldiers not even having warm socks during the wintertime. We just sort of forgot about them. But we kept NATO up, even though we promised to take NATO down. And that proved to be disastrous. In fact, we kept expanding NATO even as the Russians protested. We got closer and closer to their borders. The behind the scenes Cold War had never really stopped. It was just not in the news, and we stopped caring about it as everyday people. By 2014, Putin had had enough. He just went ahead and annexed Crimea from Ukraine as a protest against NATO expansion and the Europeanization of former Soviet republics. Around this time, this guy, Roger Stone, and this guy, Steve Bannon, started to cook up a plan for how to deal with this sort of new era that was arising, in which factory workers were losing their jobs. There was lots of disaffection amongst Americans. And even as the consumer price index was rising slowly and wages were outstripping the cost of inflation, everybody was the mainstream economists were sort of failing to realize that people were quite upset about their ability to earn a living. How is that? How was it that wages were increasing and yet people were so upset? Well, it actually turns out that the reason that wages looked to be rising was that the cost of a television, which was now being made in China, was a fraction of the cost of what it used to be. But the cost of healthcare, housing, these basic things that people need to survive, was outstripping inflation. Out-of-pocket medical expenses had become so high that real wages were declining. People's disposable income was declining over time. Somehow economists just sort of failed to notice that, but it didn't go unnoticed by everybody. These guys found a person who was willing to be their fall guy, their candidate, and they found the right guy. By 2016, this man had entered into power on the backs of American disaffection with this Clintonian 1990s style globalization. Another sort of thread here was that all of these wars that the United States had engaged in over time were not only costing a lot in terms of money, but were also costing a lot in terms of lives. There was the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, there was Afghanistan, and then there were a lot of smaller conflicts in between that left a lot of Americans with PTSD and the inability to engage in the economy, in addition to missing limbs. So the horrors of war, the economic sort of degradation of the standard of living of the average American had finally caught up in the globalization era. Trump saw other strongmen as role models for how to govern a country. You could, in theory, slowly strip away democratic institutions and take control of the government, and that would give you more power to execute an economic agenda. When COVID-19 struck in 2020, we saw the downsides of having power sort of concentrated in the hands of new oligarchs rather than in technocrats. Technocrats being a whole bunch of, economists and wonky people who are trying to figure out how to make things work. And instead, we had sort of an emotional governance style. And that was really unveiled when China, which was the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak, controlled the spread of the disease completely, as did a number of other countries, while the United States just let it run rampant. Trump lost power, and the United States went right back to its old ways of engaging in war with the Soviet Union. We threatened to move NATO even closer to the Soviet borders. We formed alliances with Ukraine. We were supplying them with weapons. Finally, Russia, Putin was just basically like, okay, well, we're going in. And we had another war on our hands. This war was totally preventable, but we were relatively well prepared to strike a final blow against the Soviets. And the plan basically worked. The Soviet army was a paper tiger, as the United States had suspected, and Ukraine was able to defend itself during the early stages of the war. One thing about the Soviet Union, though, is that they tend to do very well towards the ends of wars. They don't start off well. Like the Nazis were able to just basically rush in across the border. But after the Nazis were there, the Soviets were able to build up a war machine. And that's basically what's happened in the Soviet Union. We basically gave them range to build up a war machine. In addition, Americans didn't want another international conflict sapping up their taxpayer dollars. And this war was unpopular amongst some Americans. The Democrats were known as the Big Tent Party. They were the party that was inclusive of LGBTQ rights, of minority groups, and immigrant groups. But the Trump campaign was able to shave off a lot of these groups by forming its own kind of big tent. And that was to dog whistle to minority groups that belonged to other minority groups, and found that those alliances were stronger than their identity politics. For example, Trump was able to pull off people that were interested in cryptocurrency, that were passionate about cryptocurrency. Trump was able to pull off conspiracy theorists by signaling at his rallies with the Q for QAnon. He used right-wing white supremacist dog whistles, just signals from different groups, to indicate that he was totally open to a white supremacist agenda. He was able to pull off tech bros, obviously, by bringing in Elon Musk and the cryptocurrency people, and finally the vaccine deniers, and even left-leaning crunchy granola moms who were voting for RFK Jr. by pulling him into his orbit. Now, with all these small groups, he had peeled off enough of the electorate to win a decisive victory. Of course, that makes this class a little bit hard to teach, because we are now confronted with a vaccine denier who is the head of HHS and a whole new health policy landscape. We don't really know what's going to happen to the NIH with Dr. Oz in control, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's going to make this particular class very, very interesting, because there's going to be a lot to figure out and a lot to talk about. And this is your class.